From the archives of the great library of Arathes, golden city of elves, the wise scholars of Grey Sage present the unlikely and highly questionable accounts from those who were avowed witness. These are the suspenseful investigations of the human, Fraenk Neversleep, Arch-Preceptor of Blackroot. And now, the Neversleep Scrolls, Circle of the Mind Thief, written by Philip Walton. The story continues.
Chapter 38. Her leg was still a warm wave of discomfort as Kyla sat up on the healer's billet. The temple's nursing attendants, whom she was told were supposed to be discreet and even dispassionate in their duties of the healing arts, were somehow anything but either. From the moment Valthor brought her in, the staff became uncomfortably fixated on her. The specific attendants, which she seemed to have twice as many assigned as anyone else there, were constantly fussing with her bedding or coming in with a tray of savoury cheese and salted fish for her. Others in the building, Kyla would catch staring at her wistfully. The feeling was somehow both flattering and off-putting at the same time. Then it occurred to her why this was happening. Kyla had been living in the shadows so long that she had forgotten the effects of her Lynblood birthright. Her caretakers had called it the charm, and it was quite the opposite. Kyla experienced it as long, awkward gazes from strangers and their inexpressible desire to be close to her. This would soon turn to professions of adoration and love. And if it went on for too long, the effects became sinister, with aggressive advances and demands until Kyla would have to forcefully defend herself. She sometimes wondered if other Lynblood experienced this same thing, but she had never met another to ask. She was a most rare and elusive creature. Perhaps now that Posu was dead and she apparently wasn't welcome in Arathes, she might venture out and try to find another like her. They could live in a beautiful estate together, sponsored by some wealthy lord who just wanted to gaze at living art, like they were human peafowl strutting about with bright plumage. Just another beautiful thing to be collected. No, that would never do. She had fought for and earned everything she had. Not that it was all that much anymore. And who did Neversleep think he was to dictate to her where she could and should go? He may have saved her life, but that didn't mean it now belonged to him. The next time she saw him, she would give him a healthy piece of her mind. That thought made Kyla grind her teeth. She could not stand to remain in the building any longer where eyes were constantly on her. Kyla decided it was time to go.
"Miss, you shouldn't try to move,"
the young attendant said the moment she noticed Kyla attempting to rise. She rushed over to the bedside and gently forced Kyla back down. The attendant was a sweet-natured half-elf named Miri, who had a plain face and golden brown hair woven into a spiralling braid that was pinned up on her head according to the temple's custom. Although she was annoyingly attentive, she was less so than others, which was good. Kyla also insisted that Miri be the only one to see to her, and to do so at a much less frequent interval than the rotating nurse schedule, which had someone intruding on her with what seemed like every other breath. Miri was still a nurse's apprentice, which put her on a closer to equal footing for differences in medical opinions. And Kyla would need that advantage now as she attempted to quit her current care. "I thank you, Miri, but I must be off. I need to, Kyla grunted, unsuccessfully trying to keep her discomfort from showing in her voice.
"Oh no, miss, don't get up."
The attendant looked stricken.
"We've only just bandaged and salved your leg, plus the tincture you've taken is going to make you woozy for a while."
"You can't keep me here."
"I wouldn't think of it, my lady, but you're so special. I'd hate myself if something bad happened and I didn't try to stop you."
Kyla squeezed her hand and gave her a smile. Miri blushed shyly. "You don't get many Lynblood down this way, do you?"
"I never thought I'd get to actually see one in my life,"
she said excitedly.
"What I mean is, you're a living gift of the powers and blessed by—"
"Almost like I'm not a living person," Kyla said, an edge of sarcasm in her tone.
"Oh no, miss, I didn't mean—"
Miri looked stricken. "It's all right. I'm teasing you, sweet girl." Kyla smiled, swinging her good leg to the floor. "Help me up." Miri did as she was asked. Early on, Kyla had insisted upon a privacy screen, which made it somewhat easier for the two of them to get Kyla dressed. At least no one would be staring at her. She also took the added measure of covering her golden wavy hair in a hood and wrapping her face with a scarf. Miri's enamoured gaze seemed to diminish some, which Kyla was glad of. She wanted no further attention. Before she was nearly killed by that demon-faced Hell-Touched, Kyla had planned to sell the Inn S. Tilleborn and use the money to establish herself in a new city anyway. The pathetic entreaty of that rock-headed Neversleep notwithstanding. She had become notorious to too many people, not just the Fernbrooks, but now the partisans and arcane lords as well. Being famous was disadvantageous if one maintained a criminal lifestyle. It wouldn't be too difficult for someone with her skills to find jobs somewhere else, but she'd need money to travel. Kyla needed to get the necklace back, and if she was able to extract a little revenge along the way, all the better, she mused, with a dark grin. But her bandaged leg reminded her how that prospect was dangerous, and not one she could do alone. She had no crew anymore, and no one she could trust. Well, maybe not no one. "Where can I find the man called Neversleep?" Kyla asked. Miri seemed to find this funny because she broke out into a warm smile. "What is it?" Kyla asked.
Well, miss, all you need to do is stick around here for a while. He's bound to be in soon, with this or that injury.
Miri said.
They keep an open bed just in case he comes stumbling in.
It was Kyla's turn to smile. That bad, eh? The young woman nodded and laughed. "Never mind. I'll just be off. Perhaps I'll just walk the city and listen for the largest calamity. He's sure to be nearby." Miri suddenly gave her a serious look.
You shouldn't be out wandering Arethes, miss. It's dangerous. The priest says there's a dark moon out. It's a bad omen. There's men out there that would hurt a lady like you.
"I'll be safe, Miri. The powers watch over me." Kyla slid her small dagger out of its scabbard, showing several inches of honed steel, then clacked it shut again. "That's for the ones who need more convincing." She winked as she fixed the scabbard to her belt. Once Kyla was on her feet, Miri helped her to the door, looking heartbroken like she was seeing a dear friend depart on a long and perilous journey. Kyla found it endearing, in spite of herself. "I thank you for your help, and you have my blessing," Kyla said, lowering her scarf and kissing Miri on the forehead. It was a gesture she hadn't done in many years. A totem that was said to bring good fortune to its recipient for the rest of their days, but also one that her vile caretakers had turned into a paid service for her to perform when she was a child, and one she vowed never to do again. But now it seemed both right and good. Miri had tears streaming down her cheeks when she looked up. Kyla pulled the scarf back over her face and limped out the door. Exiting the Temple of Mersey, Kyla chose a direction at random, just wanting to be away from there. Already the shadows were growing long and the sun would be setting soon. Kyla saw the bare, tall masts of the ships at the docks ahead, not too distant, but still arduous considering the condition of her leg. A quiet, inner voice seemed to be urging yet another path. She could beg passage with a group of prioresses on pilgrimage, returning home to Bactropolis. Maybe she would even join their order. Give up the life of thievery and take a vow of charity instead. They'd certainly welcome her to their simple lives of service to the divines, and she'd never go hungry again. No more revenge or life-threatening danger. And no more excitement, for that matter. It made sense on a practical level. Perhaps this was the fresh start she actually needed. As she began to move, Kyla found that her leg was already feeling not better, exactly, but at least dull to the pain. It still felt heavy and stiff, and she moved like a woman thrice her age. But hobbling along like an old woman had one great advantage. All who passed seemed to completely ignore her. No uncomfortable stares or searching hands. She was effectively invisible. "I should have become an old woman years ago," Kyla thought with an amused chuckle. As she finally made it to the street that led down to the docks, a thin sheen of sweat had formed on her brow. She needed to rest, and the scarf was stifling. Kyla was about to remove it when she noticed the two men heading her way. Her breath caught in her throat, and she nearly stumbled. It was the same two men whom she had spied on earlier in the tavern. Coming quickly in her direction was the shady broker Dandriken and a haggard Leos Muninga. Rage, heartbreak, and fear all mixed together when she saw the man who was responsible for Posu. Not even a thought, but an impulse flooded her, and all plans for a life of service and charity vanished in a storm cloud of hate. It was as if the dark fates had provided Dandrakhan, and this was her chance to send him to Geth's door. Her hand dipped into her robes, grabbing the handle of the dagger in her belt. She would become that agent of vengeance, by the powers. All she had to do was let him get close. But as she stood, Kyla felt her hand begin to tremble as her adrenaline mixed with pain and fatigue. Could she even trust herself to strike true? She might as well have been an old woman for, in her current state, she couldn't run or fight, and the imposing bodyguard with the two-handed sword strapped to his back would surely hack her to bits whether she killed Dandrakhan or not. Still shaking, Kyla decided now was not the moment. But her revenge would come. She lowered her head and tried to look hunched and elderly, hoping her disguise would hold. She needn't have worried. The two men advanced quickly, oblivious to her presence, with Dandrakhan rattling off a diatribe of instructions to Leos, who only appeared to partially register the words. He had dark rings around his eyes and his face was pale. Something was definitely wrong with him.
Get up there and be ready to recover the necklace. That's most important. Hear me? And before you do, you must drink this.
Kyla saw Dandrakhan hand Muninga a bottle of black liquid. She barely had enough time to stagger to one side to keep from being ploughed over as they passed. Muninga took the bottle and headed up the road back toward the upper city, while Dandrakhan continued on toward the docks. The Inn as Tylerborn, Kyla thought. Dandrakhan was still plotting to get his hands on it. She also noticed the tension in his tone. He was speaking like a man whose scheme could fall apart at any moment. Perhaps he had a buyer lined up and stood to gain enormously. Whatever it was, Dandrakhan had just sent his bodyguard away to recover it, leaving him dangerously exposed. Kyla stopped and looked up. She could see the tall masts of the ships in the harbour again, ready to embark and take someone like her somewhere, anywhere else in the world. The possibilities were endless. She might journey to a place far away, where she could forget all the pain this city had caused her, and start a new life. It would be the right thing to do, and even honour the power whose own temple she had just been healed at. Forgive and move on. That's what a Lindblood was expected to do. They were not criminals or schemers or plotters of foul deeds. They were exalted and pure. That was what everyone believed. But not all the Lintyrians were about charity and forgiveness. Some were agents of divine justice and retribution. Some destroyed entire armies with their fiery blades. Perhaps that was the type of Lindblood she was too. Kyla watched for a moment longer as a single gull cut an angle across the sky away from her. Then she flipped her hood back up and turned, following the shadowed path that led down after her condemned betrayer, Dandrakhan.
Fraenk had just enough time to slip behind a crate of fragrant mushrooms before the elevator carrying Brimblade came to a stop. This new development certainly shoved a stick into the spokes of his poorly conceived plan. Perhaps they had done him a favour, however, and forced him to think for a moment before acting. He could not see what was happening from his hiding spot, but it became clear that he didn't really need to. Brimblade and Gingerglade exchanged growled acknowledgement with each other before getting straight to business.
"Is that it?"
Gingerglade asked eagerly. Fraenk had seen Brimblade holding a wooden box, gripped protectively at his chest as he entered, and now heard the Hell-Touched open it.
"Your master has use of the Mind Thief for 1 hour. 1 hour.
Then it must be returned here to me.
Yes, yes. You'll get your necklace back when...
Gingerglade's dismissive tone was cut off.
If it's not back in my hands in 1 hour, I'll come up after it with a few of my friends from below. And you most certainly don't want that.
Brimblade warned malevolently.
Release me!
Gingerglade choked, then began to cough. Fraenk wished he could see the scene of the hell-touched squeezing the snivelling elf's neck, but didn't dare move from his hiding place.
You'll have it back, I swear.
Gingerglade sounded angry, but there was fear in his voice as well. After a pause, there was the sound of the box being opened.
Not much to look at, is it?
Farathil Gingerglade said, stifling a yawn.
If you only understood its true power.
Brimblade replied.
And what dark scheme do you have planned for it, I wonder?
Go on, you're wasting time.
That's right. You're not allowed to touch it, are you? You wizards, and your traps.
Gingerglade chided derisively. Fraenk heard movement, which must have been the elf picking up the necklace, for the next sound was the wooden box snapping closed.
You wait with the hell touched. The rest of you with me. Let's go.
Gingerglade ordered his guards. All but the large, bearded man at the elevator controls formed up around their arch-preceptor, forming a tight phalanx. Frank's snatch-and-run plan was surely out of the question now. They moved as a group up the row and toward the storeroom's exit.
I'll be waiting.
Brimblade called after them as a warning. Fraenk tried to make himself as small as possible behind the crate of mushrooms. The group passed him without notice, too intent on their own purposes. He heard them go out of the storeroom and down the hall back to the kitchen. Well, you've missed your chance to get the necklace, and now you're stuck in this room with a murderous warlock and Fernbrook guard, Fraenk scolded himself. If he didn't get back upstairs and stop Gingerglade, and soon he'd never get another chance. But first he had to deal with these two. Fraenk looked down at the bucket of leeches. One of them had crawled up and latched onto the back of his hand. Revolted, Fraenk quickly pulled it off and almost crushed it in his fist, when suddenly he had an idea. Sawzon Brimblade was pacing on the elevator platform and muttering dark curses to himself when Fraenk stepped out from the shadows, striding quickly down the row. The man's dark expression first looked annoyed, probably expecting Gingerglade, but then twisted into cold fury when he recognized Fraenk. His face then changed again to surprise as Fraenk slung the contents of the bucket into the air at the two men. A moment later they were splattered with large wiggling parasites. At first they didn't recognize what they'd been hit with, only turning to face their surprise attacker.
Neversleep. I was hoping to have another chance to...
Brimblade sneered, reaching down the sheath at his belt where he kept his unholy dagger. Then something squelched wetly on his doublet, turning his attention. It took only a moment for him to register the dark, writhing creatures. He began to wail in a high-pitched voice that seemed incongruous for this terrifying visage.
Obscura vein fiends!
Brimblade screeched, batting at them furiously.
How did you escape the Underrealm?
The Fernbrook guard recoiled as well, either because of the leeches or terrible cacophony of the hell touched. Fraenk used the distraction, running quickly to close the gap between himself and the Fernbrook man. The guard looked up just in time to see Fraenk swing the empty bucket in a wide arc. It smashed against the side of his head, shattering in a spray of wet chunks of wood. He staggered backward, momentarily stunned. Fraenk kicked hard, hitting the guard in the side of his thigh. A technique he'd learned from his fight training. The effect was immediate. A nerve spasm shot through the man's leg, and he dropped to one knee with a grunt. Fraenk turned, looking for something else to bludgeon this man with, when two mighty arms locked around his chest. The Fernbrook guard had caught him in a bear hug, with one arm pinned to his side and the other up at his chests. Fraenk felt the man's muscles engage, and the air whooshed out of his lungs. Fraenk tried to breathe, but he couldn't pull in anything. His hand instinctively went for the brace of knives at his hip, but of course they weren't there. He couldn't move nor breathe. He had no weapons because of that cursed arcane lord's magical mist. All he had was the kindler. If his arms had been trapped in any other configuration, Fraenk would have found himself constricted to death by this oversized man, with his foul breath and long orange beard. With his pulse thundering in his ears, Fraenk spidered his fingers into his breast pocket until they touched the cold brass block. He tweezed the gadget between his index and middle fingers and lifted it out. Just then, the guard shook him, and for one terrifying moment, Fraenk felt the kindler slip free. An instant later, it landed in his palm. Fraenk flicked the cover open and mashed the lever which called forth the flames. Nothing happened. His vision was starting to swim as his lungs burned for air. He tried the lever again. This time, several sparks shot out of its opening, but that was all. Fraenk pressed again and again, more frantic as panic flooded him. Then the voice came again, her voice. "The flame is there. Be patient, Fraenk." He stopped, then drew his thumb down on the lever slowly. He could feel the mechanism inside catch on another internal part, with a satisfying click. Then a fireball the size and colour of the guard's head exploded from the end of the device, and instant later his beard was a fiery version of its former appearance. He released Fraenk with a surprised scream, stumbling backwards and swatting at his face. The big man collided right into Brimblade, who had just flicked away the last leech and turned his attention back to Fraenk. The two men collided and fell into each other's arms like some farcical tryst of two unlikely lovers. They landed in a tangle on the elevator platform floor. Fraenk coughed and gasped on his knees. He knew he needed to get up, but at this moment was just grateful for breath. Brimblade and the guard quickly separated, scrambling back up to their feet to face Fraenk, red-faced and enraged. Brimblade pulled his dagger, and the Fernbrook guard raised his two massive fists. It looked for a moment like there might be a competition for who would get to be the one to kill Fraenk. Fraenk rose quickly to face them, but a wave of dizziness sent him wobbling backwards toward the elevator controls. His hand landed on the brake lever of the elevator platform. The two men realized where they were standing much too late. "Going down?" Fraenk asked, then shoved the lever forward. Immediately, the platform dropped, taking a wide-eyed Brimblade and the guard with it. Rope keened and smoked through the block as it unspooled at a furious rate. The platform dropped fast, its hardware not allowing for complete free fall, but it was certainly not anything Fraenk would want to be on when it came to its terminus. He moved to the opening to watch it reach the ground with a distant crash. Both men bounced off the platform and tumbled several feet. They lay dazed on the ground, moaning. Not dead, but it would be a while before they would be able to give him any further trouble. And just to be on the safe side, Fraenk flipped the counterweight lever and let the elevator platform rise again. These two would have to go around to the main gate if they wanted back into the party. And the hell-touched man in particular would not be a welcome guest at all. Fraenk had no time to revel in his victory, however. Gingerglade was probably moments away from placing the necklace in Lord Fernbrook's hands. He only hoped he wasn't too late to stop them. Thank you for listening. Tune in next week for another exciting episode. And remember, the learned scholars of Grey Sage caution you that the veracity of these events remains unproven. Now go safe in the light of the powers until our hands clasp again.